what happens next? This is so bonkers. Is that a mission? That seems like
a suicide pact.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the chatter, unpack the really complex stuff, and give you the insights you need to really know what's going on. Today, we are diving deep into something that's not just hitting the headlines, but is honestly weighing on a lot of people. The potential for a U.S. military strike on Iran. There's a lot of talk, especially in the popular press, that this might be pushed by Israel, maybe using a conventional bunker buster on one of Iran's underground enrichment sites. Now, it hasn't happened, obviously, but the speculation, it's everywhere. And the stakes are, frankly, enormous. So our mission today, it's not really about just pondering the what if. Our deep dive is aimed squarely at the what happens next. We want to dissect why an action like that, according to our expert today, really can't be limited. It's almost guaranteed to spiral into something much bigger, much worse, maybe even catastrophic. And guiding us through this incredibly tricky and, frankly, dangerous scenario, we have a truly unique voice. Dan Caldwell, a former Pentagon official, his experience, his insights, they give us a crucial perspective on what this means for the U.S. military, for our strategic interests, and maybe most importantly, the very real human cost.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic. And look, if this strike does actually happen, I need to say this right at the top. I really profoundly hope that every single thing I predict here is just dead wrong. I truly mean that. Because the alternative, the other side of that coin, it means dead Americans. Simple as that. I was talking to someone recently, a voice you might call a neoconservative, pretty prominent. And I told him, I said, look, if this goes down and I'm wrong, please make fun of me. Call me an idiot. Coin. And I meant it. I absolutely meant it. Because the people who would be caught in the middle, they're the young men and women, just like I was, 15, 20 years ago. They're the ones who are going to be right in the thick of it. On those bases that will almost certainly get hit, the air crews flying the missions, the sailors on the ships out there, for them, for their sake. I just desperately wish all these confident predictions you hear from some people would somehow magically turn out to be right. And I'd be proven totally wrong.
That phrase, dead Americans, it lands hard. And it immediately makes you think about the actual people, the individuals on the ground, in the air, on those ships. From your perspective, having been there, worn the uniform, how do you think those service members are feeling right now? The ones deployed in the region, living with this possibility hanging over them, are they aware? Are they processing this talk back home about conflict maybe being likely?
I think a lot of them, yes, absolutely are aware. I've been in touch with a few folks still serving, and the ones I tend to talk to, they're senior enlisted, more seasoned officers, guys and women with 15, 20, sometimes even 25 years in. They're nearing the end of their careers, and honestly, a lot of them are just tired.
Yeah.
You have to remember, these are the exact same people who maybe 20 years back, they were eager. They wanted to get in the fight, wanted to go to Iraq, Afghanistan. But now, maybe it's their 7th deployment. Maybe their 8th to the Middle East, to Europe, wherever. They're just worn out. And they see things pretty clearly, too. They know the military is still incredibly overstretched, even with the big wars in Iraq and Afghanistan supposedly over. Yeah. We still have thousands of troops in Iraq, in Syria, places like that. And there's this feeling, you hear it a lot, that we've been doing this for way too long, while fundamental problems inside the military just aren't getting fixed. Things like the culture in the DoD. Secretary Driscoll is trying to tackle that with his Army reform push, which is needed, and just basic stuff like standard of living.
Barracks literally falling apart. Navy Secretary Phelan, he went to Guam, saw the Marine barracks there himself, and just shut them down. Said they were uninhabitable. That tells you something. So another war. It's not just the danger, the deployments, often last minute, to a region that's seen constant deployments for 20 years. It's also about resources, money, people, attention, all getting sucked away from fixing these critical problems at home. And that, I can tell you, weighs heavily on a lot of people in uniform.
And what about being out there right now? Say you're on a ship, Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf. An attack order might come down any minute. You're part of that operation. What does that actually feel like? Is it nerve-wracking? What's the mental state?
It's a unique kind of pressure. The funny thing, I was a Marine, supposedly amphibious, right? But I never actually served on a ship until I flew over to Iraq.
Yeah.
But talking to sailors and Marines who have done those long deployments, they describe it as basically living inside a metal container for months. I used to joke about the Navy, but honestly, understanding what it means to live on a ship for 6 months, maybe longer if it gets extended, I think I'd take multiple Iraq deployments over that. It's incredibly isolating. And it's scary because you feel like you have so little control. Things are happening to you, maybe not like infantry or a pilot feels. And there's literally nowhere to go, nowhere to run.
That sounds terrifying.
Yes, the terror is real. And we've seen it, right? It's been reported. These incredibly close calls recently with the Houthis in the Red Sea. They're firing anti-ship missiles. Now, our ships have amazing defense systems, ballistic missile defense, anti-missile systems, very effective. But there was that incident, it was public, where an F-18 fighter jet from the USS Harry S. Truman actually fell off the deck. Why? Because the ship had to make these incredibly aggressive maneuvers, likely to dodge an incoming Houthi missile. Thankfully, it didn't hit. But imagine being one of the, 6,000 sailors and Marines on that ship at that exact second. That feeling of imminent impact. Knowing you're a target, stuck in that metal box, it must be absolutely terrifying. I was thinking about that just this morning. What's it like? Just waiting, knowing something could happen any second. That uncertainty, that vulnerability, very few people really get that.
That really paints a picture, and it brings up something critical you've mentioned before about our troops in Iraq and Syria. You called them a tripwire. Can you unpack that? What exactly does that mean, and how did we end up in such an, frankly, uncomfortable situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd argue that our presence, especially in Syria, but also Iraq, it functions as a tripwire. And I think this gets right to the heart of why some people in Washington wanted to keep troops there. The idea, and it's deeply unsettling when you think about it, is that if there's a mass casualty event, say an Iranian-backed militia attacks and, God forbid, kills or wounds a lot of Americans, that incident itself becomes the justification to escalate, either directly against Iran or maybe get drawn deeper into fighting other groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So the presence itself, even if the numbers aren't really enough to deter anyone effectively, becomes a calculated risk, a vulnerability, one that could suck us into a much bigger war.
A calculated risk. That sounds almost intentional.
Well, that's the deeply disturbing part, isn't it? Whether it's intentional vulnerability or just a reckless disregard for the risk. And for me, one of the biggest, frankly, I think it was a crime during the first Trump administration, was how President Trump's own political appointees, and some in the military, actively worked to undermine his desire to withdraw troops, especially from Syria. We can't forget Jim Jeffrey, the special representative for Syria. After he left, he was openly bragging around D.C. that he lied to the president about troop numbers in Syria. Why? To make Trump less likely to order a full withdrawal. That's not just disobeying orders, that's bordering on dereliction of duty. Maybe even criminal, subverting civilian leadership like that. It's outrageous. It cuts at the foundation of how our system is supposed to work.
And you see a direct line from that, insubordination, to real consequences.
I absolutely do. I believe there's a direct line from that policy decision, that act of subversion, to the tragic deaths of those 3 Army reservists last year, killed by a drone at Tower 22 in Jordan. Tower 22 exists solely to support the U.S. base inside Syria at Al-Tanf. And Al-Tanf arguably shouldn't even have been there anymore, especially once the ISIS territorial caliphate was defeated. See, Tanf started out with a mission to train anti-Assad fighters, supposedly to fight ISIS, but then the mission kind of morphed. It became about countering Iran. The idea was to keep U.S. troops and proxies there to block Iran from moving forces easily from Iran through Iraq into Syria, like a land bridge. But then the situation in northern Syria changed. The Syrian army started working more with the Kurds. The whole original justification for Tanf just evaporated. The mission was done. By early 2024, when those soldiers were killed, if you asked Biden administration officials about our Syria policy, they'd practically laugh. Because we didn't really have one. Our troops were just sitting there, no clear strategic purpose. Except for this vague idea in some policy circles that you can never withdraw, never pull back, because it looks weak.
And the irony of it all.
Oh, the irony is thick. Because in the end, who really won the war in Syria? Arguably, Al-Qaeda did. We ended up helping replace Bashar al-Assad, who, remember, actually helped the U.S. after 9/11, took prisoners for us, shared intel on Al-Qaeda. We replaced him with groups tied to the guys who carried out 9/11. From a purely American interest standpoint, that makes zero sense. It's not a win. Tens of billions spent, American lives lost. And during that time, we came incredibly close multiple times to direct conflict with the actual Russian military, not just mercenaries. We had that big fight with the Wagner group in Syria, sure. But people forget the risk of escalation we talk about now in Ukraine. That exact same risk, U.S. and Russian forces operating cheek by jowl, was happening almost weekly in Syria for years. Russian planes, American planes in the same airspace, ground troops nearby. One mistake, one miscalculation, boom. Major power conflict. Ukraine gets the headlines now, but for a long time, Syria was the real flashpoint where U.S. and Russian forces were bumping up against each other constantly, especially after the ISIS caliphate fell. That mission should have ended. And it's just, again, in my view, a total travesty, a clear case of policy being subverted twice during Trump's first term.
That context is sobering. Okay, so let's shift to the immediate future then. Taking all that into account, what does it mean? With that very serious caveat you mentioned earlier, What do you think is the likely chain of events if a strike like the one described bunker buster on an Iranian enrichment site actually goes ahead?
Right. Well, I think the best historical parallel, maybe the most instructive one, is what happened after the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani, head of the Quds Force. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, mainly because the Iranians basically told us they were going to respond. There were probably back-channel messages. We knew it was coming. That led our troops at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, where I actually served, by the way, take cover and get out of the open. But even with that warning, Iran still fired a volley of ballistic missiles right at Al-Assad. And you have to remember, at that exact base, we do a lot of joint training with the Iraqi army. And the Iraqi army is part of the same government that also oversees the Popular Mobilization Forces, these militias that are deeply loyal to Iran, funded and trained by the very Quds Force Soleimani led. So we are literally training the allies of the people who are probably going to try and kill our troops if things escalate. It's maybe the most convoluted machine imaginable right now. We're subsidizing an ally of Iran, while our own troops there are incredibly vulnerable. Easy targets, a cheap way for Iran to inflict casualties.
Okay, so that's the response after Soleimani. What about a direct strike on Iran itself? Assuming for a moment those tripwire troops weren't even there.
Even without the tripwire troops, I'd still have serious concerns about a direct strike. Though yes, the immediate risk profile changes. If the U.S. strikes Iran directly, the key variable becomes, what does Iran's counterstrike look like? How does it impact U.S. troops, U.S. facilities? And then crucially, how does the U.S. respond to that? Because at that point, you are firmly on the escalation ladder, as they call it, and getting off that ladder is extremely difficult. If our troops get hit and we hit back harder with more force, and if we use bases in the region, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, some of those countries even let us. And that's a huge assumption now and needs repeating. The Gulf Arab states are not in the same place politically as they were in 2019. It is not a guarantee they give us permission to launch attacks on Iran from their soil. But if Iran thinks we're using those bases accurately or not, and they retaliate, they will attack those bases. And those bases are bigger targets, maybe more hardened, but they have way more American personnel. That's how you get mass casualties very quickly. They'd almost certainly target U.S. Navy ships too. In the Arabian Sea, the Gulf.
Worst case, if we keep climbing that ladder, they could even go after U.S. embassies or consulates in the region.
These sound like nightmare scenarios.
They are worst case, absolutely. But there are real risks, tangible risks. They have to be thought through. They cannot just be dismissed. Which brings me back to this whole idea, which I just fundamentally don't buy. And again, I hope I'm wrong, that you could just do 1 or 2 strikes on Iran and that's it. They won't respond. That's just, it's a fantasy, a dangerous one. If you launch that first strike, you have to be prepared for and expect a much longer, much bloodier campaign. And anyone who thinks Iran wouldn't hit back needs to look at recent history. Just hours after the initial Israeli strikes, people were saying, oh, Iran won't really respond, maybe something small. And what happened? Over the next few days, they launched somewhere between 400 and 500 ballistic missiles. Unprecedented barrage. Now, thankfully, they weren't as effective as feared, but they still killed around 25 Israelis, wounded nearly 600. That shows you, crystal clear, they have the capability and the will to respond forcefully.
So this leads to what you called an unintended war.
Exactly. An unintended war. The initial strikes, the inevitable Iranian response. It just pulls the U.S. deeper and deeper in. You get locked into this spiral of escalation. And where does it end? It pushes you, maybe even unintentionally, towards a full-blown regime change war. Even if the administration says that's not the goal. And look at the timeline. It's absurd. This potential war, it was basically chosen for us by Israel, and we supposedly got, 3 days notice? That's been widely reported. It's jarring. Suddenly we're scrambling to figure out how to manage a war with Iran that wasn't really on the front burner 2 weeks ago. Yes, the military has contingency plans for everything, plans sitting on shelves for years. But getting only 3 days warning before the shooting starts? That makes proper preparation incredibly hard. The U.S. military can move fast, sure, especially with air and naval power. But complex operations like this, without the months or years of detailed planning that usually happen, that's a huge, dangerous challenge.
Okay, that's the immediate fallout. Now let's broaden the lens. This is where it gets really interesting strategically. Iran's in BRICS now. They have growing ties, military, economic with Russia, with China. How big a worry is it that those powers could get involved if the U.S. strikes Iran? What are the wider geopolitical shockwaves?
Yeah, this is where the strategic game gets really complex and frankly fascinating. Let's take Russia first. I think Russia actually has a lot of reasons not to get too involved militarily, at least not directly. My read is that the stuff Iran would really need from Russia, advanced air defense systems, modern fighter jets, those are the exact things Russia desperately needs for its own war in Ukraine. Now, Russia's defense industry, it's surprisingly productive, more so than the US and NATO combined, believe it or not. The NATO Secretary General admitted Russia makes more munitions in 3 months than all of NATO makes in a year. But Russia's way of war in Ukraine is all about massive firepower attrition. It makes it really hard for them to just divert critical weapon systems to someone else. So maybe some intel sharing. Cyber help, sure. But significant, overt military aid to Iran, my gut says probably not.
Okay, so Russia might be limited. What about China?
China's a whole different story. Now, I don't see them jumping in militarily either, not directly. But if you ask which global power stands to benefit the most, medium to long term, from another major US war in the Middle East, it's China. Hands down. Why? It's pretty straightforward. The kinds of advanced weapons, the munitions that we burn through in a sustained fight with Iran, those are the exact same systems we would desperately need in a conflict in the Pacific, God forbid, against China itself. Or, if not direct war, the weapons we'd need to supply our allies there, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan. Think about high-end air defense, long-range standoff missiles, air-to-surface, surface-to-surface stuff. Those cutting-edge systems would be crucial against Iran because Iran is huge, geographically, population-wise. It's not small like Iraq. You've got long distances to ever say from the Gulf up to Tehran, so you rely heavily on specific aircraft, specific long-range weapons. And those are the exact systems that would be at the pointy end of the spear in any fight with China. So is it in China's interest to watch us use up those critical munitions, wear down those advanced systems in the Persian Gulf? Absolutely, 100%.
So China benefits by just watching us deplete our resources.
Pretty much. They've played the Middle East very smartly, lots of smart power, minimal military presence. They get huge economic benefits. Now, they might give Iran some non-lethal help, advanced counter-drone tech maybe, help getting around sanctions. Certain electronics Iran can't easily get from the West. And don't forget, China's invested massively in Russia, which, helps keep the Russian population relatively okay, dampens dissent about Ukraine. But look, this isn't some natural, unbreakable alliance between Russia, China, and Iran. The Russian security services are still deeply suspicious of China, just like the Iranians are suspicious of the Russians. Russia invaded Iran twice in the 20th century. But our forward-leaning policies, which I think are misguided, have kind of pushed these countries who might otherwise be rivals closer together. We've created opportunities for them to cooperate in ways that hurt us, not just in the Middle East, but Ukraine, the Pacific too.
So the risk isn't China jumping into a Middle East war, but maybe taking advantage elsewhere, like in the Pacific.
I don't see China getting directly involved in the Middle East in a way that leads to war with us there. No. What's far more likely is they watch us get bogged down, drain our resources, and then they make a calculated move in the Pacific. Because that region is what's fundamentally important to them. And I don't buy the argument that if the US leaves the Middle East, China automatically rushes in to dominate militarily. They've done well with smart power, minimal force. They don't have the global power projection the US does. Some really sharp strategists I know argue China isn't likely to try and militarily run the Middle East. However, if they see the US getting even more worn down, more resource depleted in the Middle East, could that change their calculus regarding Taiwan? Or other actions in the Pacific? Yes, absolutely. And it's not just Taiwan. Think about it from their view. We've had bases in Japan for 80 years. Korea for 75 years. That's right in their backyard. Imagine an 80-year-old Chinese base in, Idaho. We really wouldn't love that, right? So maybe their long game is pushing us out of what they see as their sphere.
And yeah, people who think hard about geopolitics are definitely worried about that possibility.
So this really frames the central challenge for the Pentagon, doesn't it? This trade-off.
It's arguably the biggest strategic challenge they face. The moment China was officially named the primary pacing threat, the main long-term competitor driving our military planning, everything we keep doing in the Middle East, became a direct trade-off against the Pacific. And economically. There's no comparison. The Pacific is vastly more important to U.S. prosperity. What happens in the South China Sea matters fundamentally more than most things in the Middle East. The Middle East is, 5% of world population, 5% of GDP. East Asia is more like 40%, maybe even 60% of world GDP. Trade, growth, the future. It's exponentially more significant. China is an actual, real existential threat. World's largest navy, hundreds of nukes, ICBMs that can hit the U.S., capacity to shut down global trade in ways that would cripple us. Russia, with its 6,000 nukes, also an existential threat, obviously.
Yeah, and Iran, in comparison.
Iran is just not in the same league. Not an existential threat to the United States itself. Iran's primary threat to us exists because we have, 40,000 troops scattered across the Middle East, many in vulnerable spots, as we discussed. easy targets for Iran or its proxies. That's the main reason there's such a big concern for us. Now, I know you hear people, like Senator Ted Cruz, for instance, saying Iran's going to nuke LA. Right now, Iran doesn't have a nuclear bomb. And interestingly, historically, Iran hasn't developed missiles that can reach beyond its region. Not because they couldn't technically, but likely a strategic choice not to appear as a direct threat far beyond their neighborhood. So when someone like Cruz says nuke LA, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. It's a talking point, designed to pump up the threat level in people's minds, to justify U.S. involvement in, well, regime change.
But Iran is a problematic actor, you'd agree.
Oh, absolutely. Let's be clear. Iran has been a major problem in the region, a major state sponsor of terrorism, no question. But look at their actual conventional power. Economy the size of Pennsylvania. Saudi Arabia alone outspends them on defense maybe 4-1. Iran's neighbors include Pakistan, a nuclear power, and Israel, with its own nukes and advanced military. Iran is surrounded by regional rivals. They simply do not have the conventional means to strike the U.S. homeland directly. What they do have, and this is a real concern we need to watch, is the ability to infiltrate terrorists, target U.S. interests abroad, maybe even at home. That's a tangible risk. But it's not existential like China or Russia.
Okay, so if Iran isn't an existential threat, and the Pacific is strategically far more important, why are we so fixated on Iran? It doesn't seem purely based on national interest as you've laid it out.
Right. There are multiple reasons, and yeah, they go beyond a purely rational calculation of national interest. First, and probably biggest, is this lingering idea among too many policymakers that America needs to be the dominant global power. Not just the strongest, but utterly dominant. This belief that we have to exert our influence everywhere, impose our values, Western liberalism, basically even in places that have, frankly, rejected those values. This relentless pursuit of liberal hegemony, as it's called, inevitably pulls us into conflicts in regions that strategically just shouldn't matter as much as they seem to. Yes, we have some interest in the Middle East, but the countries there just don't pose the kind of world-ending threat that gets hyped up in D.C.
You mentioned Bret Stephens' comment earlier.
Yeah, the columnist Bret Stephens quipping about wanting the 82nd Airborne escorting a gay pride parade in Tehran. It sounds extreme, maybe provocative, but unfortunately it kind of perfectly captures a certain mindset driving some of these policies. And in a weird way, I almost respect his honesty. He just says it out loud. Yes, I want U.S. dominance to spread liberal values. He doesn't hide behind vague talk of American interests. He's upfront about the ideology. I disagree profoundly, but I appreciate the candor. Now, this specific ideology, this neoconservatism on the Republican right, it's actually fading. It doesn't have broad popular support, especially for a big war with Iran. Polls show maybe 16% national support for that. And that's why I think the current push feels so desperate. It's like a last stand, a dying neocon fringe, as I'd call it. They see the younger generation on the right coming up, whose foreign policy views make even me look like a hawk sometimes, and they know their time is running out.
That's a really stark assessment of the motivations. Let me just circle back to a core point you made because it seems crucial. You don't believe, just practically speaking, that the goal of truly ending Iran's nuclear program can actually be achieved with just a couple of buster strikes. Is that right?
No, I do not believe that. And Ellen, let me say again, I truly hope I'm wrong about that. Could airstrikes damage the program? Severely. Yeah. Yes. Roll it back significantly? Probably. But if you want to draw on an argument, ironically, used by the Iraq War supporters, you can't really shut down a WMD program permanently, eliminate the knowledge, as long as certain leadership is in place. You can't trust inspectors completely. You can't rely solely on intelligence. That was their argument, used manipulatively then. But there's a kernel of truth in the logic. So if the real goal is to completely dismantle Iran's nuclear weapons potential, verify it's gone, ensure it can't come back, that almost certainly requires regime change or some kind of long-term occupation, maybe even a full invasion. It sounds extreme, I know, but just think through the practical steps logically. It's hard to avoid that conclusion.
Because you'd need boots on the ground to verify everything.
Exactly. You'd need to physically confirm every centrifuge is destroyed. Account for all the scientists, the engineers, the knowledge. Make sure no files are hidden. Every component, all the nuclear material, the triggers, everything potentially related has to be found and verifiably destroyed. Plus, any delivery systems they might be working on. It's incredibly difficult, bordering on impossible, to do that just from the air. You need inspectors on the ground, people physically checking. And then you get the old argument, well, the inspectors might miss something. So the argument you're likely to hear, and it's not entirely illogical within its own framework, is to truly eliminate the threat of a nuclear Islamic Republic, you need to change the regime.
So for some policymakers, it's not really just about the bomb.
That's my strong sense. For many, it's not just about the bomb. Now, let me be clear. For someone like President Trump, I do believe it is primarily about stopping proliferation. And for many other well-meaning people genuinely worried about nukes, it is too. But for a significant number of others pushing this, the end game, I believe, always was and still is regime change and the consequences of trying that. For the US, for the region, even for Israel's long-term security, I just don't think they've been properly thought through at all. It feels like Iraq all over again. People just aren't considering the day after the second and third order effects. The Iraq war started 22 years ago. We still have troops there. We only left Afghanistan a couple of years ago after 20 years. This isn't ancient history. It's practically current events for the military. Yet somehow this belief persists that you could just overthrow a regime and install liberal democracy with guns. In my view, they learned absolutely nothing from Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Yemen. It just doesn't work that way.
And this ties into your broader point about the U.S. role in the world, the contracting empire.
Yes, it fits into that larger picture. The American empire, let's call it what it is contracting. We don't have the political will, or frankly, the money, to sustain it at the level it was. We're facing real challenges from China, potentially others, for control of sea lanes, air superiority, tech innovation. The world is shifting fast, so the empire is shrinking. But how it shrinks matters. Ideally, it should be a managed decline, slow, minimal damage. Our adversaries, though, or even just competitors, they'd like to see it collapse dramatically overnight. They have an incentive to try and kick the legs out from under us right now.
And a war with Iran would accelerate that, make other commitments harder, like Ukraine.
Absolutely. A war with Iran makes supporting Ukraine at current levels much harder, maybe impossible. Think back. After October 7th, President Biden was on 60 Minutes, asked directly, can we support both Israel and Ukraine? He said, come on, man, we're America. We won World War II. Of course we could do both. Very confident. A week later, the U.S. had to divert a shipment of artillery shells meant for Ukraine to Israel for their Gaza operations. That single decision blew up the whole "we can do both" narrative right there. And that was just for basic artillery shells. What had happened was, months before October 7th, when Netanyahu was out of power, the U.S. took basically all our pre-positioned artillery stock from Israel and sent it to Ukraine for their counteroffensive, which didn't work out. So when October 7th hit and Israel suddenly needed ammo, the stockpile specifically meant for them was empty, drained. And we couldn't just refill it because we were already sending Ukraine more shells per month than our entire defense industrial base could produce. We were drawing down our own strategic reserves to critical levels.
Wow, and that's just artillery. What about more advanced stuff? Air defense.
It's exactly. Yeah. Artillery is relatively low tech.
Right.
The really precious commodity right now worldwide is air defense, Patriot missiles. Zelensky in Ukraine, his number one ask every time he talks to the U.S. is more Patriots. Well, guess what? The U.S. is going to need a lot of Patriot missiles to defend our own troops and bases in a war with Iran. So if that conflict kicks off and we start using up our Patriot inventory, we simply won't have any more to send to Ukraine, period. We are dangerously undersupplied there. And this, again, forget ideology for a second, it comes down to basic math. Our ability to sustain these high-intensity conflicts for long periods is severely limited. We're in a very shaky strategic spot because of it. Really makes you ask, what are we spending $1 trillion a year on defense for?
So the industrial base just hasn't kept up.
Not for the kind of wars we might face now. Look at Israel's Iron Dome. Well, people call the whole system Iron Dome. But that's mostly for the cheap rockets from Hamas, Hezbollah. For bigger threats, they use David's Sling, Arrow, plus our THAAD systems and Navy ships. The problem is we don't make enough of these interceptors, especially the high-end ones. We've focused on building these incredibly complex, incredibly expensive systems loaded with features. We haven't really adapted to the idea that future wars might involve huge quantities of cheaper, less sophisticated weapons, drones, rockets. Our industrial base isn't set up for mass production of relatively cheaper systems. We're still building these exquisite, highly capable, but very few systems. Example, THAAD interceptors. Public knowledge, we've only ever made about 900 to 1,000 of them, total, ever. THAAD is our system for shooting down ballistic missiles high up. Iran is estimated to have maybe 2,000 to 3,000 ballistic missiles capable of reaching Israel. See the math problem? We have maybe 1,000 interceptors total. They have 2-3 times that many missiles THAAD is designed for.
Even if TAT-G works perfectly every time, which it won't in combat, you run out fast. So again, what's the $1 trillion buying? It's buying these super complex, hard-to-build systems like the F-35, which is very capable, yes, but we just can't build enough of them or enough of the right kind of ammo to fight a long, grinding war against someone with lots of people or lots of cheap drones and rockets. We're not structured for that kind of fight.
Beyond the military math, what about the political fallout? You mentioned support for Israel.
Yes, that's a crucial second or third order effect that needs serious thought, even by Israel's strongest supporters here. If this conflict is seen by the American public primarily as a war fought for Israel, that could really damage popular support for Israel in the U.S. over time. And think regionally. Right now, you have Gulf Arab states warming up to Israel. Why? Business, stability, yes. But a huge driver is the shared threat they perceive from Iran. So what happens if Iran collapses, if that threat disappears? Maybe Iran breaks apart, becomes a failed state, just like taking out Saddam in Iraq unintentionally empowered Iran? What if removing the Iranian threat means those Gulf states don't need Israel anymore as a counterweight? They might just go back to being hostile.
Israel used to have a different strategy, didn't they, before Iran became the main focus?
Exactly. For most of the Cold War, Israel had the periphery doctrine, David Ben-Gurion's idea. Very smart. Surrounded by hostile Arab states backed by the Soviets, Israel focused on building ties with non-Arab countries on the edges, Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, to create a strategic balance. That's why even after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, when Khomeini was shouting death to Israel, Israel quietly became Iran's main arms supplier when Iraq invaded Iran in 1980. It's why Israel was involved in Iran-Contra. Many U.S. neocons who backed Israel in the 80s were still arguing for trying to maintain ties with Iran, despite the rhetoric. Because until the Cold War ended and Iraq was weakened, Israel saw Iraq as the bigger threat. They sometimes quietly helped Iran even with its anti-Israel regime. Pragmatic strategy. But after Saddam fell, Iran became the #1 perceived threat. So the question is, what happens after Iran? Does Turkey get stronger? Do other regional powers shift? We need to think about these cascading effects.
And within Iran itself, you mentioned the risk isn't necessarily a neat transition to democracy.
Right. Some policymakers seem to have this fantasy of Iranian liberals just rising up, overthrowing the mullahs, and boom, instant democracy. The reality is far messier. You could easily end up with something worse replacing the current regime. Or, given Iran's ethnic diversity, about 40% are minorities, the country could just shatter into a brutal civil war. If Iraq hadn't invaded Iran back in 1980, Iran might have collapsed into civil war then, as ethnic groups tried to break away. This might sound like dusty history, but these are the real devastating risks of regime change that just aren't being discussed enough. It feels dangerously like Iraq in 2003 again. And honestly, it worries me that for some people pushing this, chaos isn't a bug, it's a feature. Some genuinely believe instability in neighboring states is good strategy, even though it's terrible for the region, for global stability, and probably for Israel's long-term security too. They are literally betting on chaos.
That sounds incredibly cynical.
It is. Deeply cynical. It reminds me of a conversation I had recently with some European diplomats we were meeting, and a few were shockingly open about it. They said, essentially, we want the Ukrainian war to continue because it benefits us.
All right.
These were diplomats from countries supposedly backing Ukraine strongly. They want the war to drag on, not because they think Ukraine can win outright, but because they see Russia as a threat and figure if Russia stops fighting in Ukraine, they'll just turn towards Europe. Even though Putin hasn't really threatened that explicitly, it's just this chillingly cold, strategic willingness to let conflict continue no matter the human cost.
And you see a connection between that cynicism abroad and problems at home.
I do. It's incredibly frustrating watching Western leaders channel the legitimate anger of their own people about fentanyl deaths, unaffordable housing, lack of jobs, into hatred for people thousands of miles away. Instead of fixing their own failures, it's baffling. You live in a country where young people are dying of overdoses, can't get jobs, can't afford homes or families, and you're told constantly, it's Putin's fault, it's the Ayatollahs. It feels like a childish refusal to admit. No, your own leaders, your own government have failed you. It's just easier to point fingers overseas than look in the mirror.
And this impacts how the Ukraine war is pursued.
Absolutely. It makes me furious sometimes watching some Western supporters of Ukraine, and frankly many Ukrainian leaders too, because it feels like part of their strategy is just keep sending young Ukrainians to die for a victory they know isn't realistically achievable. Why? So they can feel good, say, we stood up to Putin. You have people like Ambassador Bridget Brink pushing totally unrealistic goals, like Putin just handing back Crimea. It's naive, strategically bankrupt, ignores the desperate need for diplomacy. I even heard credible, deeply cynical reports, things like elements in the U.S. military helping Ukraine or intel agencies knew about and maybe even allowed drone attacks on sensitive Russian sites, like a nuclear sub-base right before peace talks were scheduled. Why? Allegedly, to sabotage the talks, to deliberately provoke escalation, without the White House even knowing. That's subverting policy at a dangerous level.
So it comes back to the U.S. not being very good at this empire's business.
Fundamentally, yes. We are really, really bad at being an empire. We were meant to be a republic. We don't get the patron-client thing right. Our clients often end up acting against our own interests. Now, the current administration pausing some aid, that was maybe a small step toward trying to fix that dynamic. But we have a long, long way to go to change that basic mindset in Washington.
But despite all this, you believe the U.S. does have the power to de-escalate, to pull back from the brink.
I want to be absolutely clear on this. Yes, the U.S. government absolutely has the capability and tremendous leverage to de-escalate this whole situation, to tell Israel, stop, to push for diplomacy. We have the power. We have the means. Ronald Reagan, probably seen as one of the most pro-Israel presidents ever, did exactly that.
Right.
When he felt Israel was acting against U.S. interests, he used leverage, made it clear. We can do that right now. We have huge leverage over multiple players in the Middle East and, frankly, around the world. We use it incredibly badly, or we choose not to use it at all.
And internally, within the government, you mentioned concerns about dissent being stifled?
Yes. And this is deeply disturbing. The tactics being used against patriotic staff inside the administration who might raise questions or concerns. These are people who, if given an order, will carry it out professionally. Or if it violates their conscience, they'll resign honorably. That's how the system should work. But they get smeared, accused of leaking to the press. It's the same cynical playbook used by those who want a bigger war to shut down debate, to prevent honest discussion. It's indefensible. And it targets the very best people, the most patriotic, ones whose views are often closest to what candidates like Donald Trump actually campaigned on, ironically enough.
That's a powerful place to end, and a deeply insightful look at the dynamics. So for you, our listener, what does all this mean? When you reflect on the costs we've talked about, the human cost for troops, the military stretched thin, the strategic game benefiting rivals like China, the real risk of unintended escalation, consider this. If this drive towards conflict is partly fueled by an ideology of liberal hegemony, or an unwillingness to face hard truths about our own limits, our capacity, our trade-offs, how does that change how you see world events, how you interpret the news you get from different sources, and what responsibility might you have to question those underlying motives? To dig a bit deeper, to demand a truly informed perspective beyond the headlines, something to think about.